Welcome to When Things Go Wrong, Communicating with Donors in Times of Crisis. My name is Jay Wilson. I'm the Senior Vice President for Strategic Communications here at BWF. It's good to see all of you out there today for the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Carol Arvidsson, and I will pass the baton to her. Carol?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Arvidsson, Director of Strategic Communications here, and it's great to have you all with us today.
Wonderful. So we'll get started.
Yep. Any other logistics you want to pass along before we jump in?
Absolutely. If you have questions, we'd love to hear them. Put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Carol will be monitoring that. We'll try to answer questions as we go along in between slides. So we are always excited to see questions and have a chance to answer them. At the end today, we're going to provide a survey both in an email and also in the chat. A link to a survey. We'd love to get your feedback on how much you enjoyed or perhaps didn't enjoy today's webinar. So thanks for joining us. Carol, I'll hand the baton to you.
All right. So go ahead and click. There you go. So we know there's all kinds of crises that can arise in our organizations. You know, here's a quick list for you. They can be big, they can be small, they can be completely internal. They can, of course, generate all kinds of external press coverage. We know that during these times, emotions run high. You need to make quick decisions. You need to often pivot. You need to often react, and then, rinse and repeat. These can be very difficult situations to find yourself in. And this is an absolutely essential area where we all know in our work, it's far more important to be proactive. Probably at no time other than when you are facing a crisis. So let's look at some examples of what we're talking about here. Go ahead, Jay. So Equifax back in 2017, some of you may recall this. And honestly, it's really hard to imagine how this organization could have handled its data breach worse than it did. The organization discovered that some 148 million Americans had their data breached, but this organization chose to wait 6 weeks before it notified the public. And within 3 days of doing that, of learning of the leak, we had 3 executives who went ahead and sold shares in the company. So long before the public even knew there was anything going wrong, people inside the organization were taking action. So they chose not to initially notify even the people who were affected. They did go ahead and set up a website, but that website actually wasn't ready for days. And when people went to it trying to enter their information, they were told actually to come back later. You can imagine how frustrating that must have been. They began offering some free credit monitoring, but you could only get it if you were willing to waive your right to sue the company. So Equifax backtracked on that event, allowing people to sue if you actually sent them a written notification within 30 days. Then on the Friday after the breach had been made public, the customer service rep handling the Twitter account decided to tweet out "Happy Friday," which of course, as you can imagine, was not the case for millions of people who were dealing with their own crisis. We know freezing credit is one of the best ways for victims to protect themselves, but Equifax charges for freezes. So they finally relented, saying in a tweet that in response to consumer feedback, Equifax will waive all security freeze fees for the next 30 days. And then Equifax went ahead and assigned easy to guess pins to everyone who chose to freeze their credit. So this is a great example, obviously, of having a lack of speed, lack of transparency, lack of accountability. The company really didn't seem to be in control. The leadership seemed to be confused, and the organization just seemed absolutely tone deaf to what was happening in their customers' lives. So this was not just a financial crisis, but an absolute communication crisis. Go ahead. And then, of course, there's the Wounded Warrior Project. CBS News and New York Times published 2 damning high-profile news reports sharing whistleblowers' complaints and accusations of the wasting of donor money. They talked about waste and abuse, lavish conferences, unbridled spending, and in fact said this organization had spent millions a year on business class seats on airlines. They were jetting around the country for even minor meetings. They stayed in 500 a night hotel rooms. And then the last straw was when the organization chose to take hundreds of employees to a conference at Colorado at a resort and spent nearly $3 million on food, drink, and fun, all fueled by donor funds. And after the news broke, this nonprofit chose to deny the allegations and in fact demanded a retraction from the media. They did go ahead ultimately and fire several key leaders, two of whom were making over $470,000 and $369,000 respectively. The Better Business Bureau suspended their SEAL designation. They ultimately laid off 85 employees. As you can imagine, giving plummeted. It went from a peak of $373 million in 2015 to barely eking out $211 million in 2017. And then on top of it all, the organization was the subject of a congressional inquiry. So a lot clearly was going wrong here at this nonprofit. But they did a lot of soul searching, hired a new leader in about 2018 who came on and said, it's time to right this ship. And now, first, that new CEO was only making $280,000 a year. They cut significantly back on all staff outings. No more lavish events were allowed. They increased scrutiny on spending for travel and all expenses, and they ultimately earned back that seal of approval from the Better Business Bureau. Now, instead of focusing on, really feeding their own pockets and making sure their daily lives were great, they were once again focused on the wounded warriors themselves and doing what they could to make their lives better. And this crisis was clearly one of their own making, and clearly they had to solve that even themselves later. And then our last example is about KFC in Great Britain. And back then, in February of that year, this company was forced to close 646 of 900 of their restaurants. They had recently switched delivery companies and actually had a poultry shortage due to that change. So this incident really could have exposed the company to brand damage, lost revenues, definitely disgruntled customers. But they actually developed a very well-executed PR strategy that repaired, the damage because of speed, saving the brand reputation, and maintaining their trust with customers. And here's how they did it. So within hours of the problems coming to light, customers already knew what had gone wrong, how it was being resolved, and when it would be fixed. The company did not blame anyone else and instead apologized to their customers and even their teammates via social media channels and newspapers. They head-on addressed customer questions on social media, and then they even tweeted out various Q&A to keep everybody informed of what was happening as they were answering these questions. They were very transparent about the steps that they were going to take to bring operations back to normal. They provided a link to a web page where they had all this information in one place. And then this company was very smart in staying on brand in their communications. So they decided, as is par for the course with their ads, to inject a little bit of humor into this situation. So they used puns and stated things like, sorry, this was a monumental cluck up. In one post, they wrote, the chicken crossed the road, just not to our restaurants. And then in that apology ad, they were very candid about, and here's how they wrote it. A chicken restaurant without any chicken, it's not ideal. Huge apologies to our customers, especially those who traveled out of their way to find we were closed. And endless thanks to our KFC team members and our franchise partners for working tirelessly to improve the situation. It's been a hell of a week, but we're making progress, and every day more and more fresh chicken is being delivered to our restaurants. Thanks for bearing with us. And I encourage you actually to go out and Google that ad, and you'll get to see the colorful way that they posted the ad and the headline they used on a bucket of chicken. The really smart thing they did all along is that on all of their social media, the key messages all came from Colonel Sanders himself. So they stayed on brand, and they actually turned what could have been a very serious crisis into an opportunity to really, really gain even more customer loyalty. This has often been called a masterclass in crisis communications. So as we go forward, and I'm going to turn it over to Jay at this point, we're going to try to give you a sense of actually how to go about doing that. But before we do that, we would love to hear in the chat, and I'll kind of watch for this. Let me know if you remember any of these three examples. So Equifax, Wounded Warrior, or the KFC example. Just curious how many of you are aware and remember these. Yeah. I'll say as I'm looking at these chats, chat responses,
Yep.
Equifax is definitely coming out as the one most people remember, followed by Wounded Warrior. And I will say that you're all reinforcing the point of when crisis communications is done expertly, then people don't remember it. So the KFC example, while you can find lots of information online about it, we don't remember it because they handled it so masterfully. So thanks for sharing which ones you remembered. And clearly we remember the ones that went very, very poorly.
And really, that's the first lesson in crisis communications is you're always remembered when things go wrong if you don't respond the right way. So I took a page with the pun here, fully intended, from the author Page Center at Penn State. They have a wonderful definition of crisis communications. And it's a great place to start when we think about putting together our own plan. I love this definition for a couple of reasons. And part of that is, the first part of that is I love the use of the word collection, processing, and dissemination. Collection describes the internal process that you're going to have to use in order to get information ready to give to the public. Processing refers to the approval process, which is critical and key in any crisis communications plan. And of course, dissemination really gets to getting the right approved information to the right audiences at the right time and the right way. So they do a lot of really explaining with three simple words: collection, processing, and dissemination. Frankly, the other reason I love this definition is it's so peaceful. It makes you think that crisis communications is a day at the lake, a Sunday picnic, a happy drive with family, when instead, as anyone's been in a crisis knows, this is what it feels like to be in the middle of a crisis. So once you're here, once you look like these folks, it's really too late to have a plan. But the good news is you're not there, at least not yet anyway. So what can you do today, this minute, as soon as we're done here with the webinar, you get back to your office, you finish your lunch, what steps can you take? Well, obviously developing or reviewing your crisis communications plan, communicating on a routine basis with your most important audiences, focusing on reputation management. All of these things here you see are great steps. I think it's important that all of you are here today. You at least understand the importance of this first step, but the other four are just as important. In the case of your donors, and perhaps your other audiences, it's very important that you're communicating with them when there's no crisis, and that you're doing so in ways where you're not asking them for anything, whether it be money or time, but you're just having a routine basis for communicating what's going on with the organization and why they're important to it. It's important you do that all the time. Be aware of how your organization is perceived. Someone on your team should be monitoring social media and ratings agencies and bring to the table a real understanding of how you're perceived as a baseline before a crisis even begins. As communications people, it's important that we're vocal in leadership meetings, and that we pay attention to trends in media that may affect us. The role of a great communications professional is to yell iceberg dead ahead long before the iceberg is too close to avoid. So pay attention, speak up, communicate, and make sure you have a plan, all things you can do today and every day. Carol, do we have any questions in the chat before we go into the planning?
Nope, not at this point.
So let's make a plan. There are 5 core components to every plan. Internal processes is talking about your communications tree internally. How people learn about the crisis, how people approve messages for crisis. You've got to have that nailed down as part of your core components in any crisis communication plan. Key messages here, I'm talking about core messages for your organization. Who are you? What do you stand for? What are you all about? These key messages are really important, and they should be driven home every day, long before a crisis hits, but they should also be a core part of your plan, because it's going to help remind you when everything else is going wrong, who you are and what you stand for. KFC certainly understood their key messages. They certainly understood what they were all about, what their tone of voice was, and that came through when they responded. On the other hand, Equifax really did not. Clearly, they didn't understand how other people viewed them and what their real role was in society. Spokespeople. It's not always going to be the president or the CEO that speaks on behalf of your organization. In fact, in some cases, probably in most cases, it really shouldn't be. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, if it's always the president, the CEO, or the chairman of the board that is speaking on behalf of your organization, you may unnecessarily elevate the crisis to a level it wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. Secondly, sometimes the best spokespeople are those most closely aligned to a situation. So think of your dean of students, your volunteer director, someone who's working in the process or working as part of the process in the affected area. So figure out your spokespeople is a really important part of starting your crisis communications plan. And finally, know your key audiences. Be prepared to directly message people by audience. Crises are unpredictable, which is why you need a plan B and a plan C. It's also why they're called crises. So to determine in advance contingencies that you can foresee, things that might go wrong beyond just the crisis. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the core components: have an internal process in place, have key messages ready, spokespeople identified, key audiences targeted, including your donors and your prospects, and be ready for anything, because anything is coming. Now we have 4 key objectives in every plan. At the end of the day, when your plan is complete, all of these things should be accomplished. You should be providing accurate and timely information to targeted internal and external audiences. You should be demonstrating this concern for safety of everyone affected by the crisis. In some cases, that can be very serious, like with Equifax. In other cases, the people that are affected are just people who wanted to have fried chicken. You should safeguard all your organizational facilities and assets and maintain a positive image of the organization as a good community or corporate citizen. In the cases we remember, Equifax and Wounded Warrior Project, they really didn't do a good job of maintaining a positive image for the organization. KFC did, and it makes a difference. Now, safety is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, but essentially you have to demonstrate a real understanding of the situation and communicate empathy for everyone involved. If you're doing that and you're reaching these objectives, you've got a really strong plan in place. Carol, do we have any questions from the audience?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right, let's go to the table of contents. Now, every plan can be arranged however you want, of course, internally. But I think these 5 areas have to be in every table of contents and therefore in every plan. You have to have a section that talks about your internal and external audiences and identifies who will speak to each. You have to have a part of the plan that will speak to your centralized messaging, including your key institutional messaging, but also put in place how you're going to arrive at the crisis messaging, who's responsible for creating it. Then you have to have a chain of approval. And really, this is so important, because the time to figure out who needs to approve your messaging isn't in the middle of the crisis. It's today. It's right now. We all work for really complex organizations. And if we have to take the time to figure out who needs to see what before we can send it out to an audience, during the crisis when things are going wrong, it's too late and mistakes are going to be made and people are going to be left out of the process that perhaps should have been included in the process. Or alternatively, sometimes you'll have too many people in the process and things will get bogged down and you won't be able to react in the timely way you need to in order to navigate a crisis. So getting that chain of approval established and approved ahead of time is critical importance and a big part of any crisis communications plan. Finally, we need to identify communications platforms, dividing them by audience and spokespeople. So if we think about our audiences and how we're going to reach them and who's going to talk to them, all of that needs to be laid out in black and white. If you want to email your alumni and have the alumni receive an email from the Alumni Affairs Executive Director, put it down in writing. There's no time during the crisis to figure out who needs to speak to which audience. And finally, contingencies. Things can go wrong, things will go wrong, and there are probably elements within the crisis that you can game out ahead of time. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So you can put that in black and white so there aren't as many surprises once the crisis begins. Any questions on the table of contents before we move on?
Well, not necessarily on that, but we do have a question.
Okay.
This is the question. Do we inform our internal audience first?
The answer to that question is yes. You absolutely do inform the troops first. The people that are working with you should be first to be informed that the crisis is happening. They do not want them to find out through social media or through earned media channels like newspapers, TV stations. You don't want them to find out from their neighbor. You want them to hear the bad news from you first. So the answer there is yes. So let's look at audiences. I think it's important that every crisis communications plan be broken down by audience. And what I'd love to hear from each of you is if, as we go into an area perhaps that you work in, are we leaving anybody out? Anybody you can think of as you see our internal audiences for higher education and our external audiences? If you see anybody we're leaving out, I'd love to see it or hear about it in the chat. Carol?
Yeah, someone lifted up parents, which would be important.
Absolutely. Parents is a very important, and depending upon the institution, parents can be considered an internal audience as well.
Someone else offered up vendors.
Vendors, great one there too. Obviously part of your external audiences. All right. Let's move on to nonprofits and healthcare, academic medicine. Anyone we're leaving off there that you think we should be added to this list?
Well, it's likely here that vendors should be included again. Outside partners, nonprofit partners.
Nonprofit partners, right, for nonprofits. If you're closely aligned with another nonprofit, the people there need to know, and not from outside sources. They need to hear it from you. Absolutely. All right, well, let's move on then. So the second piece of our table of contents is centralized messaging and staying on brand. I love what KFC did. We included that one for a reason. They were so on brand. They were so funny. They tackled what had to be an obviously embarrassing crisis. I mean, a chicken restaurant that runs out of chicken, you know, in the abstract, that's pretty funny. And they understood that while it wasn't funny for them and for their customers, and certainly not for their employees, people who were impacted by the stores having to close, they did maintain a sense of humor. They remembered who they were. And they made statements that reflected their core values. They did express concern. They weren't flippant about it. They said, boy, you know, it's pretty bad when you run a chicken restaurant and there's no chicken. And they apologized. I think this is really important. They apologized, they outlined changes, they explained what was happening, and they owned it. And if you compare that to, say, the Wounded Warrior Project, where I think they really forgot who they were. You know, the Wounded Warrior Project has an amazing mission. They're a really important nonprofit in this country. And they do great work for veterans and their families, and they should be recognized for it. And somewhere along the way, they forgot who they were. They were not reflective of their core values in their actions or in their statements after they were caught. And they did not express outward concern to the people they were supposed to help. And they certainly did not own or apologize or outline changes until so much had happened that a complete change in leadership was required. So if you think about your centralized messaging and how you're going to talk about what is going on in your crisis, remember KFC and Wounded Warrior Project. They went about it completely opposite ways, and the results speak for themselves. But it is easy to get off the rails during this part of your program. So as you're writing down and putting it in black and white, talk about social media discussions. How are you going to respond in social media? Who is going to be in charge of responding? What your messages will be in social media. Write about, put it in black and white that you're not going to blame shift. You're not going to point fingers outside the organization, with the exception of crises that perhaps are thrust upon you rather than created by you. And we can talk a little bit about that later. But for the most part, have it in writing, not going to blame shift. Some crises happen to you and some you create. Understanding the difference is really important because it changes how you message. You have to message accordingly. But if it's something you created, you have to own it and get it in writing in your crisis communications plan that you will do so. So that there's no pushback when the time comes. Okay. Third element of your crisis communications plan that you're absolutely going to need to put in writing is a chain of approval. Said it before, I'll say it probably again before we end today. The time to figure out who's approving your messaging is not when the crisis is happening. It's right now, today, next week, but before the crisis happens. You also should be thinking in terms of a chain of approval if it only affects one part of your organization. let's say that the crisis is only going to impact students. It's maybe there's a crisis around a fee for students that wasn't approved in the proper way. And so most of your messaging has to be to students and parents, but maybe it doesn't impact alumni, maybe it doesn't impact donors. So as you're thinking out your chain of approval, come up with contingencies in black and white in writing to say, okay, if the crisis is just going to impact student affairs, this is the chain of approval. If it's university-wide, this is the chain of approval. If it's only going to impact our volunteer team, this is a change of approval. If it impacts the entire nonprofit, this is the chain of approval. And so the other thing you want to make sure of is you want to put in timelines. How long can we take? Timeliness is really important in the middle of a crisis. Everyone should understand from the crisis communications plan that time is not something that can be taken too long. And we have to be sure that we are set with a specific timeline for each and every crisis plan. Okay. Communications platforms. Communication should be centralized, but your communicators don't have to be. So we want to discuss here and put in writing who delivers each message and how each message will be delivered. Both of those elements should be audience-based. And we shouldn't forget that picking up the phone is not only an option, but for donors and for volunteer leaders and for board members, calling them on the phone is a really important part of any communications plan. Don't treat everyone the same. Assign staff to monitor your social media. Alert leadership to challenges you find on social. And engagement on social should be limited to approved messaging. This is not the time for a Twitter war. I think KFC did it best. They responded with humor, but they responded with their core messages. I do think that as you're putting together this piece in writing, you should also assign social media monitoring to different pieces of your organization, different people. I would use titles and not names, because names change, but titles will stay the same. And the final piece of your table of contents should focus on contingency planning. So obviously there can be natural disasters, there can be leadership that's involved, a lot of fluid situations. So you want to be thinking about the answers to the following questions. How do we respond if we don't have power or cell service or our normal means of communications? How do we respond if the president or the CEO or a board member is at the center of the controversy or a big part of the controversy? How does that change our approval process? How does that change our spokespeople? How does that change our messaging? Also, how are we going to respond if we learn new information that might contradict what we originally thought? Or how do we respond if there's nothing to report? It's said the nature of boards a vacuum, but the media and your audiences really abhor it during a crisis. So you need to start thinking now and putting in writing how you will reach out to your different audiences, even in times when you don't have a lot to report. Sometimes it's worth saying, not much has changed, but we're still working on the situation. With that, I'll pause and see, Carol, if there are any questions.
There are not.
In that case, I've got one more crisis to tell you about. This one that I went through. I worked at Florida Tech for about 8 years, and Middle of my time there, we'd lost a guard killed on the campus as part of a botched robbery attempt during spring break. We had a plan in place. We had a crisis communications plan that outlined all 5 of the elements we just talked about. I received a call from the Vice President of Student Affairs at 4 o'clock in the morning, very much the dreaded 4 a.m. phone call. By 6 a.m., we had our first messages prepared to disseminate. We had coordinated with the Public Information Office at the local police department, handling the investigation. We had a press conference at 7 a.m. with television and newspaper reporters from around Central Florida, including, as you see here, the Orlando Sentinel. Prior to the press conference, the president of the Institute had called each trustee personally to let them know what had happened. We had sent an email to students and to parents, to alumni, to our faculty and staff, and to our donors. The email came from the appropriate personnel on campus. So students and parents heard from the Vice President of Student Affairs. The Alumni Affairs Executive Director reached out to our alumni. Faculty and staff were learned about what had happened from the Chief Operating Officer and the Provost. And donors heard from our Vice President for Advancement. Several donors, in fact, were updated throughout the course of the day by phone by both the Vice President for Advancement and by the President of the Institute. So very quickly, we had gone through the first 4 pieces of our table of contents. The 5th part, the contingencies, continued on for some time. We had to push back on mischaracterizations about what had happened that were reported in the media and also on listservs on campus. This was in the days before social media, but the process was the same, sticking to core messaging, pointing out the facts, being very precise and deliberate in how we talked about what had happened, what we were doing as a result, and how we were changing policies and procedures. In our case, the security guard had been killed as part of a botched robbery, but he was alone at the time. Private universities in the state of Florida are not allowed to have armed guards or armed police, so he was unarmed. We changed our policy, and we talked about this to all of our publics, so that the security guards worked in tandem and worked with golf carts as opposed to patrolling on foot to make them less of a target for criminals. We also included the victim's family in messaging, particularly around the memorial service that we held on campus, and in any messaging that would refer back to his work on campus, his personal life, anything to do with his family. His immediate survivors were included in that approval process. Obviously, this is something that would not have been written in the original document, the original crisis plan, but was part of our contingency planning. And so it was easy enough to implement. Finally, the story had long legs, as any murder would. There was an update on the story once arrests were made. And so we had to revisit probably the worst day in the history of the campus again once there were arrests. Then there was a trial. In this case, there was a mistrial and then a second trial. And in every case, in every chance that something happened, we had to revisit this, we had to stay on message, and we had to move forward. So those were some of the contingencies we faced, and we did account for them in our crisis planning.
Okay, we do have a question.
Sure.
Did someone coordinate all of the messages that different people sent out, or was it the same basic message?
Great question. The very first message was basically the same basic message. We had to, the one that was sent out before 7 a.m. today that our security guard was killed, the same message went to all of the audiences just because of time. As the day progressed, updates were sent that were a little more tailored, a little more targeted. And then, of course, over time, say to the alumni, we stopped emailing them, but there was a story in the alumni magazine later, a memorial story for the guard. Donors received more timely updates and continuous, but those were targeted donors, especially those that had given, not without getting too far into details, the security guard was killed on a part of campus that was affectionately known as the Jungle. There were about 1,000 donors a year that gave annual gifts for the upkeep of the botanical garden. The botanical garden on campus, so all the botanical garden donors were alerted. We did a memorial in the botanical garden for the security guard. We had an event at that memorial, and we invited all of those donors. So the communications changed over time based on who the audience was. But the very first message was essentially the same for each. Other questions?
No.
Okay. So let's talk about being the communications officer during the crisis and what that means. You have to be clear-eyed in your assessments. If everyone around you is losing their heads, you cannot. You have to understand your audiences at all times, what they're expecting from you in relationship to the crisis, and you have to be in control of the process. You have to be nimble and timely. And if you work in development communications, you really need to make sure that what you're doing there is a two-way street. You want to hear as much as you want to give in terms of information. And I think you can make the same case in our case at Florida Tech. We're very mindful of what the students needed from us, very mindful of what the guards' colleagues needed on the security team and what the faculty may have been feeling, and so on. So during the crisis, you have to be listening as much as you are talking. You have to be receiving as much as you are giving. And you have to be humble and inexhaustible. Crises, by their very nature, are relentless, and they take more time than you wish they would to resolve. I think that is something we all learn as communicators. So after the crisis, and I love this Chinese character. Chinese character for crisis, as you see in the red bar there, is a blending of two Chinese characters, one for danger and one for opportunity. And I think every crisis an organization faces provides both. If you fail to do a good job in your crisis communications, you're going to land much more on the danger side than on the opportunity side. But as KFC showed us, both do exist. I think if you're successful, you're going to detect the crisis early. Think about Equifax sitting on the information for 6 weeks. That's really not early, not by any stretch of the imagination. Your organization should function properly during and after the crisis. Learning happens within the organization. What we saw with Wounded Warrior Project until they had a leadership change was there was no learning going on within the organization. They also didn't share with their audiences what lessons they had learned. KFC did, and I'm happy to say that, when I was at Florida Tech and we were dealing with our own crisis, we made changes to how we did security patrols based on what happened, and we told our audiences exactly what we had learned from the murder on campus and what we were going to do to try to prevent it from ever happening again. When you get to the end of the process, you just want your reputation to be maintained or even improved. KFC is one of those rare cases where they handled it so adroitly that I think their reputation improved. Equifax is still bleeding and is still hurt by their response. I think if you ask anyone today, and we are almost 5 years after the fact now, what they think of Equifax, you'll get a negative response. And it goes directly to not only what happened, which was bad enough, but the response to what happened and how they communicated afterwards.
So Jay, we've got a couple things that people are sharing, and
Right.
the first is, and this is thanks Sharon for lifting this up for all of us. She shared with us wanting to acknowledge the LA County Sheriff's crisis yesterday when 25 cadets on a run were hit by a wrong way vehicle at 6:45 a.m. She thought the Sheriff's Department did a great job in informing the public. So it's wonderful that some real-time examples that are happening.
Absolutely.
Just as we're even having this conversation. And then the other is a question, which is this. The problems I've run into at all the institutions I've worked at is how to respond to the typical individual donor who contacts me or a development officer to discuss their concerns. Maybe the leadership has handled the crisis well on a public scale, maybe they haven't. Any tips for managing those conversations? So those one-on-ones when you get personal outreach.
Well, I think the first piece of that is making sure that you are reaching out to donors individually, at least your large donors, the ones that you would normally be cultivating on a very personal level anyway. If someone does reach out to you that's a donor that perhaps you haven't had that level of involvement with, I think the first thing you have to do is really actively listen. And then when you bring their concerns to leadership, you have to ensure that they're actively listening as well. It's very easy to become defensive, to think you've handled it just perfectly. You don't understand why there's a problem. But I find that listening and then being empathetic to those concerns goes a long way. A lot of times people just want to be heard. And if you can successfully convey to them that not only that you hear them, but the changes are on the way that will address the concerns they have, even in a private setting, even in a telephone call, I think that's an important way to manage that conversation. We hear you, we understand, this is what we've done so far, but we're not finished. I think sometimes the finality of a crisis is fool's gold. Crises never really end. If you have one person that's still affected, you have to address that.
Another question is this: who should be involved in creating a crisis plan?
Well, I think your head of communications should be in charge of it. And I think each member of the leadership team, if you think about your executive committee, should have a role to play. Maybe that role is just in approving. Maybe that role is in being part of upfront committees and discussions about, brainstorming sessions, if you will. But ultimately, it falls on the communications professionals within the organization to develop the plan.
And then how about how often it should be updated?
It should be updated every time there's a leadership change. It should be updated anytime that you start something new. So if you have a new program, or you have a new college, or if you have a new oncology center, you should have a new crisis plan. Because remember, the crisis plan is for the organization overall, but it also needs to reflect the pieces and parts of the organization. And then I would also update the plan if you review it and parts of it are clearly out of date. For example, if the last time you picked up your crisis plan was 2009, and you don't have a section on social media, it's time to update your plan. Any other questions at this moment, Carol?
No, there are not.
All right, well, just some final thoughts. And this is really important. I think in all crises, beyond the communications piece of it, organizations must be ethical. They must be accountable to their publics. They must be responsible for what, especially if the crisis is something they did, and they must be transparent. I've told both internal and external clients over the years that when you have a crisis that is your fault, like, for example, Equifax, you cannot talk your way out of that crisis. You can't talk your way out of a crisis that you behaved your way into. The only way out of that crisis is to behave your way out of it. So to be ethical, to be accountable, to be responsible, and to be transparent in all of your dealings going forward. And with that, Carol, we have a few minutes. If there are any final questions?
Nothing in the chat. I think one other thing that certainly came to mind for me as I was hearing this today is that it also seems like it's probably worthwhile, once you've been in a crisis, to do a post-mortem and figure out what went really well, what didn't work so well, where you need to make some changes now that you've been through it, because of course, you know, the anticipation can be very different than the reality. And so that would be the only other tip I think would be worth thinking about, that you just do some reflection after the fact. So, yes.
I think that's right. I think a crisis communications plan has to be a living document. You don't write it and put it on the shelf. You get it down, you look at it, you revise it. And if you have a crisis, you'll learn what parts of your plan really worked well and what didn't work so well. And you can adjust accordingly for the next time. Because if there's one thing we know for sure, there'll be a next time.
Absolutely. And yes, if you're all looking at the chat, you'll see that we will share a copy of the recording with anyone who registered for today's session. We also are asking you to share your feedback, not just about today, but your ideas about some future topics that we might be able to cover in this webinar format. So there's a link currently in the chat, but you'll also get that link in a follow-up email. But we'd love to hear from you too. Please share ideas.
We'd absolutely love to hear future conferences and future webinars from you. Thanks so much.